Give it another minute as we see people coming in. All right, let's get going here. Good afternoon. Thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Porter Fraker. I'm co-head of sales here at Boosted.ai. It's my pleasure to introduce one of our co-founders and COO, Nick Abe, who will be leading us in a discussion about LLMs, generative AI, and applicable use cases and workflows in the finance space. Nick is a programmer at heart who sold his soul to the finance world early on in his career and now has over 20 years of financial markets experience, having worked as a trader, research analyst, portfolio manager, and investment banker. He's also helped to launch about a half a dozen hedge funds up in Canada, co-founded a sell-side brokerage firm. But his in-depth knowledge of the financial markets combined with his programming and technical expertise has been instrumental in allowing us here at Boosted to successfully bridge that gap, which often exists between capital markets experts and developers. But his unique two-sided perspective here makes for an exciting discussion. I think generative AI and LLMs have been on the top of everyone's mind since ChatGPT hit the market at the end of 2022. For most folks, 2023 was spent trying to figure out exactly what these LLMs are, what they're capable of, and how to prepare our data and tech stacks to work with them. But really, now the question is, what can they do to work for us? How can they make us more efficient, specifically in the finance space? And in a world where everyone is being tasked to do more with less, it's a very topical subject. And so I'm going to turn it over to Nick to lead the discussion. I think we'll have him chat for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end. But thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And over to you, Nick.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Porter. It's kind of nice to start off all presentations with a hype man. So maybe I'll have you follow me around everywhere we go. The goal of this presentation isn't to sell you on Boosted AI as the greatest LLM finance out there. Ultimately, my hope that you get out of this is a better understanding of LLMs, how they work, and ultimately how we think that they're going to impact the asset management industry. And then hopefully we can have a good Q&A discussion at the end. And hopefully this brings a lot of I guess, topics of discussion to light and a better understanding of exactly what the future will hold. So with that, I'll dive right into it. The first kind of stuff that I want to talk about is what exactly generative AI is and how it works. I'm going to put aside all of the all of the video and image stuff and talk solely about text. And the first thing that we have to do is really understand kind of what generative AI is. And I'm not going to go into crazy detail here, but when we talk about generative AI, what we're talking about are LLMs, or large language models. And really what LLMs are these gigantic models that operate on the basis of taking in as much unstructured text data as possible and using that data to train itself in order to predict the next word. So we've all used ChatGPT before, and what it does, if you say, what is the weather like in Toronto today, is understands that as its kind of prompt. And given that it knows that you've said, what's the weather like in Toronto today, then it can predict the next word is the, and now what is the weather like in Toronto today? The, question mark, the, and then predicts the next word is weather, and so on and so forth. And so ultimately, this is a really cool technology, and that it is not obvious to me that human brains work in a crazily different way. We come up with some kind of a thought and then we form a sentence, right? And ultimately, I believe that's what the LLMs are doing, right? But I think it's important to understand just like how much raw horsepower is being thrown at this problem, right? We've estimated that the training power required for GPT-4 in terms of like electricity usage was 60,000 megawatt hours. To give an idea of what that actually means, you could take your Tesla and drive 216 million miles on that amount of energy. That's enough to go around the Earth 8,600 times or from the Earth to the sun and back. So like a tremendous amount of power, which I think speaks to the brute force nature of what's going on right now. And it also speaks to why like NVIDIA is having so much success in the market. You need a lot of chips to get this done. You need a lot of power to get this done. You need a lot of processing. You need a lot of just like everything to get this done. It feels very magical, but behind the scenes, there's like a ton of computing power, data, etc. happening. And so what does that actually mean? So from like a ChatGPT perspective, we're all used to interacting with it. We're all used to like typing stuff in. And the way that it actually works is it has this huge LLM training set, right? And again, the way that I would describe it is take all of human knowledge and put it in the machine to hopefully help us answer the question of like, what's the weather like in Toronto today? But the problem with that from a finance perspective is when you think about like all of human knowledge or, you know, a lot of knowledge, very little of it is going to be finance based. Or like if you were a physics person or a chemistry person, very little of it's going to be physics or chemistry. It's still capable of learning that stuff, but it's going to get dwarfed by the other knowledge that's out there. And so ultimately, what people are doing to get the best results from an LLM perspective is fine tuning that. You can take a pre-trained LLM and then train it on a specific knowledge base to create a fine-tuned LLM. And the idea there is, let's just take some economics textbooks. Let's take 10Ks and Qs. Let's take analyst reports. Let's take whatever and modify the LLM so that it's much better at a specific task, whether that task is finance related, whether that task is physics, whether that task is like we've seen drawing images or videos or whatever, we can get it to the point of being very good at a specific thing. And from a user perspective, that doesn't really change the kind of interaction, which is I ask a question, and if I've built a weather specific LLM and I ask it, what's the weather like in Toronto? The weather specific LLM is more likely to give a better, more detailed answer than the kind of like generic answer that you get from ChatGPT. So what you're going to get across the whole kind of LLM space is a lot of fine-tuned LLMs for specific tasks, accounting, legal, HR, whatever. You're going to get LLMs that are very good at a specific thing, but they would be much worse than ChatGPT at other things. Whereas OpenAI is very focused on building artificial general intelligence that is good at everything. Firms like ours are going to be very focused on building specific LLMs that are good at the specific task that we're trying to accomplish. And so you still run into the problem of how do we answer the question of what's the weather going to be like in Toronto tomorrow, right? That's a trivially easy question for us to answer by going to Google, but the LLM doesn't actually have access to that information and can't solve the problem because the LLM training, as we've talked about, takes a tremendous amount of time, a tremendous amount of energy. And the exact date slips my mind, but GPT-4, I believe, is trained up until like April or May or something like that, 2023. So if you ask it, what's the weather like in Toronto tomorrow, it has absolutely no ability to answer that question on its own because the information that it has access to is now 9 or 12 months out of date. So ultimately, how do we get around that problem is this process called retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. And you create a retriever system that kind of understands what's going on, what is the question that is being asked, and then it can go out and retrieve the specific knowledge that is required. And by doing that, when you're now answering this question of like, what is the weather going to be like in Toronto tomorrow? I now know as the LLM, oh, this is a weather related question. In order to answer weather related queries, the smart retriever is going to go out, find to me I'm going to go to weather.com, ask it for the weather in Toronto tomorrow, and now I'm going to augment my prompt. So what the machine is going to see is, what is the weather like in Toronto tomorrow? Also, weather.com says the weather in Toronto tomorrow is going to be -7 or whatever temperature. Then the LLM gets that response and is able to generate a much better answer. In the context of finance, what this basically means is there's so much finance data floating around there. You're never going to have an LLM that's trained like up to the second and has access to all that data. So if you can create smart retrieval systems, which will go out and find the correct data, augment the prompt with that data, then you're going to get a much more likely to be correct answer and a much more accurate answer. And when I say likely to be correct, what I mean is this like lying/hallucination problem that we've all heard about. And really what that means is when the machine doesn't have a good answer, it often makes it up. And the reason it does is trying to be helpful and is trying to take the best information it has available. And there's a famous law case where ChatGPT made up the answer and totally fabricated cases that happened, again, just because it's trying to be helpful. In the case where you explicitly give it the information, it is much less likely to exhibit that type of behavior. And so like these are viewed as the best way to get highly accurate answers out of the LLM. Basically use this smart retriever system, make sure that you're generating correct information around it, and then use that to generate your answer. The other benefit is basically once you've used this, you can also use this information to validate the answer and ensure that the answer that you're giving is rooted in reality and based in facts. So what does that all mean? Ultimately, we feel like LLMs are going to be best used in task automation. And the reasoning behind that is these LLMs are capable of understanding things, like it's capable of understanding what does it mean when you ask me that weather question? And then what should I do with that weather question, et cetera, right? But it's not necessarily going to be fantastic at much higher level reasoning, which involves a lot of I guess, higher level thought processes, a lot of base knowledge, a lot of like really deep experiences. At the current state it's at, it's not going to be great at doing that. So if we can restrict the information that it requires to answer the question to very specific knowledge, then you're going to get a better result. So with basic reasoning, but also access to basically all human knowledge with very good recall, and its ability to work 24/7, then we're going to get to this world where basically LLMs are going to be very task oriented, at least in the near future. As Porter was talking about, 2024 is all about figuring out how do we make use of this technology. And the way that everyone is making use of the technology is finding very specific tasks and getting those tasks automated by using the LLM. And it's important to note that I guess like historically, the tasks that it's automating have been tasks that have been like impossible to automate before because they would have involved so much like rule creation and understanding. But now that we're basically at the point of being able to ask the machine a specific question for it to at least understand the question we're asking, and if we augment it with additional information for it to give a reasonable answer back, you can now basically take all of these like very bespoke processes and convert them into automated workflows, taking that human intelligence and bringing scalability to the process. And so like, I want to make sure that we all understand the kind of like complexity behind it. It's not going to be as easy as basically saying, hey, ChatGPT, build me a portfolio of stocks, right? What's going on? Now, that may be the ultimate user interface, to be clear, but what's going on behind the scenes involves a lot of extra pieces and a lot of extra building. And so using a very specific example, if you wanted portfolio optimization, what would have to happen in order to make that a reality? The user would say, hey, I want you to automate my portfolio, but the task would have to be built in such a way that basically all of these subtasks are achievable by either the LLM itself directly or by an agent that goes out and understands every single part of the pipeline and reaches out to the correct systems in order to do it. And again, this process can be made easier by the existence of LLMs, but it doesn't necessarily make it so it's just like magic that you ask ChatGPT and ChatGPT is going off and creating these optimizations for you. And so again, with very specific examples, we're talking about how does the machine understand, oops, what the contents of your portfolio are? Does it understand what identifiers to use, what the weights of the portfolio are? Probably not. It probably needs to reach out to some data store that actually is storing all this information for you. Then it needs to go in and get pricing and factor data for those specific securities, which basically means it'll probably need to execute some code. That code might also hit some other data store in order to get all the pricing and factor data for those securities. It then needs to understand that constraints are an important part of the optimization process. And as a result, it either needs to ask you for more clarification, what constraints do you want to optimize this portfolio under, or it needs to have default constraints that are built into it. Then it needs to understand the optimization methodology you want to use, and then correctly format that problem for some external optimization model that is going to take all of these pricing and factor data information, the constraints of your portfolio, feed it to that optimization model, and then basically get results back. Then it's going to have to be able to understand those results and potentially explain those results to you. So from a user perspective, all you're going to see is, hey, optimize my portfolio, but there's going to be all these jobs going on behind the scenes before you finally get your ultimate task output. So it's not going to be fully magic. It'll feel like magic, but there's going to be a lot of work that needs to go on from a development perspective, an engineering perspective, a like database perspective, to actually make sure that this stuff occurs and occurs correctly and occurs the way that the user wants it to. So you're going to see startups or large companies in every single vertical, again, law, accounting, HR, sales, whatever, going out and figuring out what are the most valuable and relevant tasks that need to be done, and then building the whole pipeline behind it in order to ensure that it can be automated and the user can get this kind of like magical feeling of asking a specific question or asking for a specific job to be done and then getting it done. And I think all of that kind of like rolls into the impact to asset management from an AI perspective. And we all know what we're seeing in asset management, which makes us a little bit unique compared to other industries, which is data that's available to us is exponentially increasing. And what that means to me is 10 years ago, if you wanted to buy credit card data and integrate it into your investment process, that was probably going to drive some alpha for you. Today, you probably need to be aware of that data. You need to have it built into your workflow in order for you to just like break even with the market. But at the same time, what we're seeing is fees compressing. And we're seeing fees compressing for a lot of reasons, ETFs, more people moving towards passive versus active, et cetera. But the ultimate end result is there are fewer people or the same number of people working, but those people are being asked to do way more work. They have to understand all of this data. So ultimately, we need to be able to accomplish more with less in order to have success as a business within asset management. And so what does that actually mean when you take that do more with less? You take what the LLMs are good at, which is task automation, and actually like think about it within an asset management framework. And very broadly speaking, I think about asset management and I think about daily tasks, stuff that we need to do every single day to keep on top of the market, keep on top of our portfolio, understand what's going on. I think about slightly less frequent tasks like idea generation and monitoring. And then I think about very specific like scenario tasks, which might be extremely infrequent. And I think about these tasks in a kind of like increasing order of complexity where probably the daily tasks are the easiest, but they also suck up a huge amount of our time. And when I say easiest, I mean easiest to do from an LLM perspective. And then you get into idea generation, which again, we don't spend quite as much time doing, but will be slightly more complex to get accomplished from an LLM perspective. And then finally, scenario tasks, which will be the most complex to get done, which we spend the least amount of time on, but could become extremely valuable if we could do it more often. And so what this means to me from a daily task perspective is stuff that we all have to do literally every day. I got to read the news. I got to understand what's going on. I got to keep on top of it. I got to understand What's driving the market? What's driving our stocks? Is there anything in particular that's changing in the market that I need to be aware of? I need to read analyst reports for that same information. I need to keep on top of any earnings reports from my companies. There's probably a laundry list of other things, but these are like good examples of stuff that we need to be on top of right away. And that what we're seeing a lot of, both from Boosted and other firms, is taking these tasks and summarizing them, and then trying to save the user time by giving them summarized answers. The next level of task, these idea generation tasks, probably 95% of people that I've ever talked to in asset management have told me, I have a 3-step investing process, or I have a 7-step investing process, or I have a 9-step investing process. So if we can get to the point of understanding what those 9 steps are, generating tasks for all of those 9 steps, and basically taking your knowledge and scaling it to every single stock in your investable universe, then we've actually made your process much better, much more scalable, and much more systematic, I guess. So instead of having to pick 20 stocks that are on your watch list or 50 stocks that you overall cover and trying as one person to run your 9-step investing process against it, you can have the machine go off and do that every minute of every day with every new piece of information that comes in, and effectively create this like ranked list of stocks that are doing best under your very specific investment style, mandate, and process. And then finally, you get into scenario tasks where you're going to have to tie a lot of these concepts together, where basically you need to understand on a deep level what every single company is doing, what the specific KPIs for these companies are, and how they're impacted by interest rates or how they're impacted by oil, and be able to do like deep scenario analysis. Again, not that as a human, we're not capable of doing it, but it's very difficult to do on more than 1 or 2 or 5 stocks. Being able to do it across the whole S&P 500 in an instant is going to drive a lot of efficiency, and it's going to create this environment where basically you, by using this technology, are taking your process and you can spend more time refining your process and less time doing the actual like grunt work behind the process and making sure that you're reading the news, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to get all of that information summarized, analyzed, and concluded for you in kind of a, well, who knows what the ultimate form factor is, but a report, a email, a text, doesn't really matter. You're going to be able to have a virtual analyst that is the equivalent of having 20 analysts on your team constantly going out and doing this work for you. And so what does that mean kind of like in a very practical like example? Here, the way I think about it is, if you have your ideas, if you have very specific reasons why you think NVIDIA is a buy, or the machine generates these reasons, or you have investment policies that you need to follow, you can basically feed all of that into a task, understand, and have the machine understand, okay, I want to buy NVIDIA. For this reason, I want to buy Meta for that reason, I want to buy Apple for this reason, and then basically bring it to scalability. Because if you're doing the work on refining your investment hypothesis, but the machine is doing the work on validating the sentiment behind that hypothesis, understanding that NVIDIA is really positively related to generative AI, negatively related to interest rates, et cetera, and then basically able to like conclude in this research style report for you, here, based on your investing hypothesis, is what's going on in NVIDIA. And then take that to the next level of automation and say, do this job for me and keep me updated on all the stocks in the S&P 500 relative to my investment hypotheses every week, every day, every month, however often you want to get that information. Keep me updated via text every time some breaking news happens that's going to negatively impact me. And taking all of that power, both the power of your research experience, your investing experience, your market experience, and the power and scalability of AI, is going to be ultimately where I believe that asset management is going to go to. Which then finally, I guess, brings me to why I think early adoption matters. And I think in a lot of cases, we can all agree that finance is a stuffy industry that doesn't like to change. And that's fine, but ultimately, this technology is evolving extremely rapidly, and taking the view that we're just going to wait to see where the chips fall and see what solution we adopt 3 or 4 or 5 years from now, I think is the wrong solution. And the reason I think that is, number one, I asked ChatGPT, what are a bunch of stocks where they were early adopters, built themselves an insurmountable lead, and basically beat their competitors. It came up with this list of 5 stocks. It came up with a bunch of detailed reasons as to why each of these fit that category. But I think ultimately, we probably know the story behind all these stocks. You know that Amazon was one of the first to want to do retail. You know Amazon was one of the first to want to adopt cloud computing and push it out there. You know that Microsoft jumped on the PC bandwagon super early. You know that Google developed a way better search algorithm that still drives a humongous percentage of its revenue today. You know that Tesla dove into EVs and basically created that market. And you know that Apple, despite not being first in the smartphone market, dove into touchscreen and app store in a way that makes it virtually impossible for anyone to compete with Apple. And by being early adopters, they generated a lead, and it became impossible for other firms to follow. And fine, that is what it is. Maybe you think that finance is not the same as all of these industries, and we can always catch up. But I think the important thing is AI is not this like magic thing. What AI is a tool. And the way that I think about AI is I think about it like Excel. You would never go out now and say, I have a better process because I use Excel. But in, I don't know, 1995 or whenever Excel first came out, if you were an analyst that used Excel and you spent the time, effort, and energy to build a financial model in Excel, as opposed to having it on, I don't even know what people used before Excel, it was before my time, like a slide rule or whatever, pen and paper, you were able to cover more companies faster. You were able to update your model faster. You were able to generate this advantage over your competitors by using Excel in a very specific way that was custom built for what your use case was. And finance isn't the only people that use Excel. It's one of the most popular programs of all time. Everyone out there was able to take Excel, build worksheets that mattered for them from a finance perspective, like the CFO of your company probably uses Excel every day, and they're using Excel in a very different way than you're using Excel. And the same is going to be true of AI. Everyone who has a very specific job is going to be using AI in a different way, and you're going to need to make sure that AI is doing the tasks that you want it to do in a way that makes sense for you and your business. And so what that means to me is that AI is basically this building block, and every one of these tasks are building blocks. I'm really bad at graphics, but hopefully you get the idea here that I built in this slide, that every single one of these bricks are a task that you might want, and there's infinity of these tasks. These are just the ones that I put on the screen, that you might want AI to be able to do. And in order to do it correctly, you're going to need to spend, and your organization or some startup that's going to come and provide the software for you is going to need to spend the time, energy, and effort to make sure that like ESG compliance is being done right, or earnings analysis is being done right, or client communication is being done right. And without spending that time, energy, and effort, you're going to have a whole bunch of people in your organization who have never used Excel before, and then are going to be asked to use it for the first time, while other organizations have been using it for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And the skill set on their team is going to be a lot better and a lot more adapted to the technology that's available than the people who were still using, pen and paper instead of using Excel back in the day. I've covered a lot of stuff really quickly, but I think that the Q&A is probably like the best use of our time going forward. So if you're kind of interested in anything that we're talking about, you want to talk more in depth, you can use this QR code to book a demo with us. But I'm going to turn it back to Porter, who's going to lead the Q&A section.
Perfect. Thanks, Nick. And I think, to sum it all up, there's been a lot of talk around these LLMs over the last 14 months, and I think everyone has in the back of their mind, is this thing going to replace me or not, or when? But I think as we think about it in terms of this task manager for us, back to Nick's Excel example, it's how can they work for us? How can they make us more efficient and really just be better at our jobs? And so I think as we go forward, the more people that are armed with these tools are just going to have that leg up against their competitors. But let me pull open the questions here and get started. The first one is, how difficult is it to prepare and upload proprietary data to your LLM? And how do you ensure it is kept private? Do you offer any on-premises solutions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's two different answers to the question. So the first version is we've been using structured data in our platform for a very long time, and a lot of our customers have uploaded their own custom data to the platform, which is housed in our public cloud. We've spent a lot of time ensuring that that data is secure and unavailable for anyone other than the customer that has uploaded it. We can take the same processes that we used for that structured data to allow our users to upload data that is unstructured, but the cost for it is significantly higher than the structured data. And even with all of those precautions, there's a lot of customers who are uncomfortable with the idea of potentially there's some kind of an issue. So we do have a private cloud solution, not fully on-prem, but where we can use AWS in conjunction with the pipelines that we've built to allow our users to upload data to their own private cloud and then get the benefit of all the pipelines and task automations that we've built out.
In terms of that types of data, and with prospects or clients you've talked to, is it like internal emails or research reports, or what type of data on the proprietary side has been talked about the most?
It's really anything. I think like a lot of people want to provide the sell side research again for their own like unique benefit that they have access to and that they pay for. They want to take the management notes for when they meet with companies. They want to take their internal notes and put all of that in there. I think all of that is kind of user dependent and it's all process dependent. And I think ultimately that is where the on-prem / virtual private cloud deployment becomes more valuable for large asset managers, because every large asset manager has their own process and their own way of doing things, and being able to like automate however that data is currently being held in their system and being able to feed it to a task pipeline that is specifically engineered for their output is kind of what all of the large asset managers that we've been talking to have been looking for.
Thanks. I think that will segue nicely into this question. And basically, how will active investment managers differentiate themselves as this technology proliferates in the investment process?
Yeah, and again, I think this is a really great question, because I think that there's a lot of concern that basically like, well, what it's going to look like is I log into ChatGPT and I say, hey, ChatGPT, should I buy Microsoft or not? And then if ChatGPT says yes, then how am I going to differentiate myself from the guy next to me who also just asked ChatGPT if they should buy Microsoft, right? But at the end of the day, the kind of point of this presentation is that I don't know if we're anywhere close to the LLMs actually being able to do that and do a good job of it. And when they are actually capable of doing a good job of it, it's actually going to be driven by your own investing hypotheses and your own thought process, not specifically what the machine is thinking. So going back to the Excel example, just because everyone in asset management uses Excel doesn't mean that there's no reason to use it, right? The value of Excel comes from you being able to build a better model, or you being able to build a better portfolio, or whatever you're using Excel for. And your inputs into that model, your ability to like build a better model, your ability to understand what's going on in that model is what's going to drive value. Similarly, on the LLM side, it's just going to be your ability to create an investing hypothesis, your ability to understand what's going on in the market, and your ability to have that conversation with the machine so that it can pull the right data, the relevant data, and make a better informed decision based on your investing thesis is what's going to differentiate asset managers going forward.
Cool, thank you. How do Boosted deal with information made up by the models? I guess, yeah, dealing with hallucination rates within these large language models.
Yeah, another really good question. Obviously, we've all had the experience where like ChatGPT or whatever lies to us. But really, there's a simple solution around that, right? So number one, as I talked about, these like RAG or retrieval augmented generation systems severely reduce the amount that LLM systems will lie. But number two, since in finance, we are using structured data and we have the answers to these questions already, we have sources of truth. We can validate any answer coming out of the machine to ensure that it is not hallucinating, that any like facts that it's presenting are actually rooted in some kind of reality. We can probably, I don't want to like overpromise, I don't want to ever say 100%, but you can probably get like a 99 or 99.5% reduction in hallucination, which when you really think about it compared to a human is probably good. We've also all had the experience where I myself have thought something and totally messed it up. Or I myself have had a memory that was completely wrong or whatever, right? So if we can get this to the point where it's highly accurate and providing relevant, good data, it's probably going to be better than most of us were at remembering these data points and the overall accuracy that we provide.
Cool, thank you. See one more here. Have you considered how your process could be applied in the areas of responsible investing and/or corporate sustainability?
I feel like all of these questions are on fire today. They're like directly on topic and directly relevant, I think, to the vast majority of the audience. And I think the same exact thing is true as what we just discussed here, right? We spend a lot of time talking about task automation from a like investment decision-making perspective, but excuse me. But tasks can be in any segment. So imagine a world where your firm or you have a specific ESG investing mandate and you can describe what that looks like. You want to invest in companies where the board is at least 50% women. You want to invest in companies that are like LGBTQ pro or whatever. You want to invest in companies that have good water usage policies. If you can describe what these are, then you can generate tasks around all these things, and then you can automate those tasks. So you can basically, whether it's in a pre-trade or a post-trade compliance system, understand here's exactly what our ESG policies are, and we've systematically applied them by forcing these tasks to be run relative to all the stocks in our universe or relative to all the stocks that we were about to trade. And so you can basically automate the ESG compliance component to get to the point of actually making sure that your policies are being enforced in the investment decisions that are being made.
Perfect. Thank you. Here's one more on the operations side, but how can Gen AI be used to extract data points from disorganized data? As an example, press releases for orders that a company has received.
Yeah, and I think there's kind of like a two parts to this answer. Number one, making sure that you have access to that data. Number two, being able to like get that data out most effectively. And what that means to me is like, are all the press releases pseudo-random? Do they have an actual like structure around them? In the cases where they have structure and that's all you want to do, maybe you want to build up a bunch of specific rules and or a pipeline around getting that data out of the system. If not, then it's all about making the problem as simple as possible for the machine and creating a pipeline that's going to go out, break up these documents appropriately, and effectively like remove all of the like factoids or whatever you want to call it to extract the relevant data. I think there's lots of firms that are out there doing that already, either from a 10K perspective or from a kind of like analyst report perspective. And it's stuff that we're kind of like actively working on and that we need to be able to do in order to support that like custom data use case that one of the earlier questions asked about.
Thank you. Let's see one more here. This is an interesting one. How can you extend beyond the investment management process and read like a real-time news feed and highlight impactful insights without having to, go in there and read all the news yourself? So I guess it's two parts: is how fast can this task manager work, and can it be applied to reading all of the news at a second-by-second basis?
Yeah. And so I think the first part of the question of like how fast is really just like a function of the pipelines again. How fast can you get data to the machine? And then how large is your machine that is processing the data? If you have hundreds of articles that you got to chew through and each article takes 1 second, then you're going to be, 100 seconds behind. If each article takes 10 seconds, then you're going to be 1,000 seconds behind, so on and so forth, right? Or do you have the ability to spend more on what you're doing? And can you process 100 articles at once or whatever, right? This is exactly the problem, just as an aside, and why NVIDIA has like crushed their numbers multiple quarters in a row, because every single industry out there wants to automate as many tasks as possible, wants to make it as real time as possible, and we need like as many chips as possible in order to like get that done. So if you solve that problem, then you can make it as real time as basically you're willing to afford. And then the problem just becomes like, how do you actually like filter down that information so that you don't get information overload? And again, I think that's where like having a deep understanding of what task you're trying to accomplish and why really comes in. So if you have a really good understanding of the KPIs around a company and the investing hypothesis around a company, then when you get an article from Apple about like a Mac OS update, you know that that's not something that you have to like bother people with. So you may process that article in real time or near time, but it's not something that you're going to like text or notify your users about.
Excellent. Here's more on the implementation side. What would you say is the minimum team size needed to prepare our data and operate it on a private cloud version of your LLM, and maybe like the expected project length to do this?
I think realistically speaking, we can get a lot of the value pretty quickly. But I think that what everyone's going to want to do is get some solution. Like, I'm never going to come here. Well, maybe not never, but like certainly not today. Am I going to come here and say that you're going to get a perfect output from any of these systems, right? But we can launch the system reasonably quickly and get an output that's 75 to 80% correct. But I think a lot of people are going to want to get that extra 10%, that extra 15%, get an answer that is like 90% correct. And when I say correct, I don't mean correct from a factual perspective. I mean correct from a what's your workflow perspective, what's the answer that you're hoping to see perspective. And I think that like it's going to require work on both sides, both the like Boosted side and the customer side, in order to like wrangle this pipeline and wrangle the LLM to get that 90% correct answer that people want. And so it's hard to answer into a specific team size without knowing like the specific task that we would want to automate. But I would assume that it's going to take someone from the Boosted side, someone from the business side, meaning like someone who's heavily invested in getting this task correct, and then someone from the technology side to make sure that like the data that is coming from the customer side is as accurate and flowing as smoothly as possible.
Next question is more from the quantitative side. You're describing how fundamental investors can be more efficient with their process, but how are quants using this data in a systematic process, or either that or generating a signal that they can add to their models?
Yeah, this is a great question as well, because I think that like one of the challenges with quant is you need a lot of back-tested data in order to like train your signal, in order to test your signal, in order to make sure that you're like happy with what's going on, which can make it a challenge to use some new sources of data like credit card data, sometimes even short interest data within a machine learning model. However, we know that like a lot of these quant systems can tend to like fail in cases that are like obvious to a human. And so the way that we get around that is by buying like a lot of stocks so that any one failure is not that big of a problem. Very simple example being like some stock gets bought or some stock is rumored to be bought, and the machine wants to short it or whatever. That's not a good outcome for people. However, now with this technology, you can easily, and sorry, I think a big important thing is you cannot use this LLM technology easily to create a good point in time qualitative data set. Because ChatGPT was trained on information up to 2023, if you ask it how it would have invested in 2017, it has advanced knowledge of everything that's going on. So you can't go backwards in time and create these data sets unless you're willing to train these LLMs at each point in time, which would be an extensively expensive conversation. So I think that the best thing to do, and what we're seeing a lot of our customers doing and what we're doing ourselves, is take this qualitative LLM data and apply it as an overlay to your signal, where basically you can understand, okay, right now I know generative AI is super duper hot. Can we use LLMs to find stocks that are correlated or work with generative AI so that I don't short any of them, right? And put that on top of your signal so that you don't make some of the obvious mistakes that a machine would make. From a quant perspective, I know that probably every quant machine out there is wanting to short NVIDIA right now, but that's probably not the best move, right? And we can easily put some qualitative roadblocks around that happening by using LLM technology to generate better data sets.
Excellent. Next question is, I guess this is more around how close are we to these things being able to replace stuff in the research process? But the question is, how close are AI systems, in your opinion, to replicating the analysis that bottom-up fundamental analysts perform? Could an investment chat GPT be created that churns out investment write-ups with buy, held, and sell recommendations?
I think the answer is we could literally do that now. But we would run into some of the problems that the other questions created, right? Which is like, well, if you create an investment chat GPT, how is it answering these questions? So number one, it's going to be answering the questions based on information that we feed it or hypotheses that we feed it or the like underlying data pipeline that we create around like explaining the KPIs for every single stock. And the value of building that investment GPT might not be there relative to using that investment GPT to replicate as many parts of the process as possible, but still leave the human in charge of the most important parts of the process, which are basically understanding what is actually like relevant for a stock and then making the final decision around whether this is a good stock to buy at this moment in time or not.
So yeah, again, thinking about it more from a task automation portion where humans still needs to be out there meeting with management, building their own Excel models. But then it's all about the data that you're putting into these, and maybe it can, write a report for you after that.
Exactly. The more simple you can keep the task, the more likely this is to have success in today's world. Maybe there's a 5 years from now version where like all of this stuff is going to get all done within the LLM. But like from our perspective, from a user perspective, we can take all of these subtasks, marry them together, and then create a powerful like output. But what we're doing is just asking it to do very simple things at every step along the way to create that scale and efficiency.
This is more of a broad question, I guess, but can you draw or explain the value chain and highlight use cases along it?
Yeah. Unfortunately, my graphic skills, as we talked about before, are subpar at best, so I can't draw it, but I can explain it. And I guess like from my perspective, if we go back here, at least from an asset management to this, right? There's daily tasks, idea gen tasks, and scenario tasks. And this is all within the idea, or sorry, the investment decision making value chain. I think that like the daily tasks are really good right now from the perspective of like being able to summarize them and whatever. The idea gen tasks are almost there. And then the scenario tasks remain a little bit hard, but they're like maybe months away from being solved. So like pretty much every step along this chain is actually going to be automatable. Still going to need a lot of human input in terms of guiding the machine, but going to be automatable within the next couple of months. And some of them are already there in the case of like the daily tasks.
Perfect. Next question is more around our platform, asking what data sources are you currently training your LLMs on? What are you looking to do in the future? If it is equity specific, are you looking at ETFs, SMAs, alternatives, fixed income?
Um, That's a lot. There's some stuff in there I don't want to answer probably. But basically like what we're working towards is creating everything so that it can be systematic. And we want to be able to train the LLM. And this is part of where it's like very valuable to have the users that we have and the customers that we have. So that we can understand like what are good or bad outputs and then be able to train the LLM to better understand how to generate good outputs based on the like inputs that it gets. Um, and then when you think about like the applications of this technology within the asset management space, obviously there's all the task automation that we talked about. But then I think probably like the ultimate form of this is people will be able to create their own investing hypotheses, their own investing styles, their own like specific universes, and then basically create their own indexes that the AI can go off and manage for you and perpetually manage for you, and then take those indexes and convert them to ETFs or SMAs or whatever the case may be, in an automated fashion where again there's a human in the loop because the human's creating all of the kind of like core underlying like hypotheses that the machine is working off of. The machine is just going off and evaluating those hypotheses in a systematic way. I don't know if you got any of the oh yeah, so that one came from the Q&A on the Zoom itself, right?
Okay, one more, just around implementation. Is this easily integrated into other software platforms? Do we have to go to your website to be able to get it? How can we connect this to our own workflows?
I mean, that's a lot of work that we really want to do in terms of like partnering with other portfolio management firms or other basically firms in the fintech space to do more of this automation. Everything that we have available in the platform is also available via API. So really it comes down to us like understanding what software that our customers are using, understanding like which firms we want to engage in the integration with, work with first, and understand like how difficult or hard that is on a kind of like case by case basis. But since everything's available via API, all of that work should be reasonably speaking easy.
Okay. Another one is Boosted focused primarily on the LLM space, or do you work in machine learning data processing as well?
Yeah, we grew up as the machine learning data processing kind of firm, basically, right? Like our platform was designed around the idea of taking structured data and helping asset managers answer the question of using machine learning and using my own specific like factors and features that I care about, what stock should I buy and sell? And so that's underlying all the like kind of core of our platform. But the last couple of years, we've like really spent a lot of time, energy, and effort building up LLM workflows that we think make sense. And I think, like I talked about before, the ultimate idea is going to be marrying all of these things together, where you can get like a quant perspective, you can get the earnings perspective, you can get the news perspective, you get your own investing hypothesis, you get your own investing style, and you marry all that into a series of tasks that are going to be run relative to your whole stock universe. And you're going to kind of constantly be able to monitor everything going on within that universe relative to what you care about.
I think we have time for maybe one more. This one is more from the wealth management space. But we're talking about the investment research process. Have you thought at all about using generative AI or your LLM technology for automated reporting for the wealth management space?
Yeah, so that's one of the projects that we are actually going to roll out really soon. I think the idea is if we understand what's going on in the market from a macro perspective, we understand what's going on in the market from your portfolio perspective, and we understand what's going on in the market from a bottom-up stock perspective, and then we have your own investing style, we have your tilt that you want to have, right? Like how you would describe yourself. We can take all of these pieces and convert it to a piece of client communication that effectively tells the client, here's what's gone on in your portfolio over the last 2 weeks, month, whatever. But again, the human in the loop is the very important part of that process, where you're describing and explaining to the machine how you want this to be written, but it's doing the vast majority of the grunt work for you, collecting the relevant facts, sourcing it, doing all the rest of that jazz.
Perfect. I think we'll wrap it up there. But again, want to thank everyone who has joined us and stuck with us to the bitter end here. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us on the team here. Put the QR code back up, which will link you in, and we're happy to demo the platform, what we've built so far, and discuss anything about your LLM journey with you. But again, thanks again. Thank you, Nick, for doing this for an hour, and we'll see everyone out there.
Thanks, Porter. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate you guys listening. Have a good one.